At 07:30 hours on August 31st, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Harold Larson stood in flag plot aboard USS Saratoga, watching the radar screen as Japanese torpedo bombers closed from 15,000 yards. The carrier was operating 260 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, launching combat air patrol to protect Henderson Field. Her crew had been at general quarters for 3 hours tracking a Japanese submarine that had been shadowing the task force since dawn. The submarine was I-26, and she had been maneuvering into attack position for the past 90 minutes. At 07:48 hours, I-26's periscope broke the surface, 1.5 yards off Saratoga's starboard side. Commander Minoru Yokota observed the massive carrier through his optics, calculated firing solution, and ordered 6 torpedoes launched in a spread pattern. Saratoga's lookouts spotted the periscope at 07:49 hours. The officer of the deck ordered emergency turn to port. The 36,000-ton carrier heeled over her 4 massive propellers, churning water as she accelerated to 25 knots. Destroyer screens moved to attack the submarine. But at 1,000 yards, even with emergency turns, there was not enough time or distance to avoid everything. At 07:50 hours, one Type 95 torpedo slammed into Saratoga's starboard side near frame 120 below the waterline. The explosion tore a hole 30 feet wide and 20 feet high. Water poured into 3 fire rooms. Electrical power failed throughout the forward section. The ship took an 8-degree list to starboard. Speed dropped from 25 knots to 13 knots within minutes. This was the second time Japanese torpedoes had hit Saratoga. It would not be the last. Over the next 44 months of war, Saratoga would be hit by torpedoes, twice bombs, 3 times, and would survive kamikaze attacks that sank other carriers. She would earn 7 battle stars, more than any other American aircraft carrier. And when the war ended, when every other pre-war carrier was either sunk or worn out, Saratoga would still be operational, still capable of launching strikes, still fighting. But on that August morning, with water flooding her machinery spaces and her speed cut in half, Saratoga's crew faced their second major battle damage crisis in 8 months. The question was not whether they could save their ship. They had already done that once. The question was whether they could do it again, get Saratoga back into action, and continue fighting the war that was barely 8 months old, but had already cost 3 American fleet carriers. The story of how a converted battlecruiser became the most resilient aircraft carrier in World War II began 24 years earlier when the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 forced the United States Navy to choose between scrapping partially completed capital ships or converting them to aircraft carriers. USS Saratoga was laid down at New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey on September 25, 1920, as battlecruiser CC-3. She was designed as part of the Lexington-class battlecruisers, 6 massive ships planned to counter Japanese battlecruiser construction. The design called for 43 500-ton displacement, 8 16-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 33-knot maximum speed, and armor sufficient to resist 14-inch shells. Construction proceeded slowly through 1921. By February 1922, Saratoga was 27% complete, with hull plating installed and machinery spaces taking shape. Then the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, limiting battleship and battlecruiser construction and capping carrier displacement at 27,000 tons. With 2 exceptions, nations could convert 2 existing ships up to 33,000 tons each. The United States Navy chose to convert battlecruisers CC-1 and CC-3 into aircraft carriers USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. The decision was controversial. Converting incomplete battlecruisers would take years and cost millions. But the alternative was scrapping the hulls completely, and Navy planners recognized that aircraft carriers would play important roles in future conflicts. The conversion plan retained Saratoga's massive hull machinery and power plant, while removing the gun turrets and superstructure. A full-length flight deck, 888 feet long and 106 feet wide, was constructed above the main deck. An island superstructure was built on the starboard side, containing navigation bridge flight control and massive funnel. The flight deck was supported by massive trusses extending from the hull. 4 elevators connected the flight deck to the hangar deck below. The forward elevator measured 48 feet by 48 feet. The 2 amidships elevators measured 48 feet by 44 feet. The aft elevator measured 40 feet by 48 feet. Each elevator was hydraulically powered and could lift aircraft between hangars and flight deck in 30 seconds. The hangar deck measured 528 feet long and 69 feet wide, with 18-foot overhead clearance. A lower storage deck provided additional aircraft parking when needed. Total aircraft capacity was 78 to 90 aircraft, depending on types embarked. Normal Air Group included 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers. Saratoga retained her original propulsion system, 16 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating steam for 4 General Electric turbo-electric drive systems. The turbo-electric system was unusual for warships, but provided excellent control characteristics. Total power output was 180,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 propellers with a maximum speed of 33.25 knots. This made Saratoga the fastest carrier in the world and one of the fastest major warships of any type. Defensive armament included 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. 12 5-inch Toron 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns were positioned along the hull. The 8-inch guns were intended for surface combat against cruisers, though no carrier would ever use them in that role. Later modifications replaced the 8-inch turrets with additional anti-aircraft guns. Armor protection included a 7-inch belt along the waterline, 6-inch bulkheads at machinery spaces, and 2-inch deck armor over magazines and machinery. The armor scheme was designed to resist 8-inch cruiser shells, not 14-inch battleship shells. Underwater protection consisted of multiple compartments designed to contain torpedo damage. USS Saratoga was commissioned on November 16, 1927, Captain Harry Yarnell commanding. At 36,000 tons standard displacement and 888 feet long, she was the largest warship in the world. Her speed, aircraft capacity, and size made her the most powerful aircraft carrier afloat, a position she would hold until Lexington was commissioned 2 months later. For the next 14 years, Saratoga operated in peacetime, training pilots, developing carrier doctrine, and participating in fleet exercises. She spent most of her time based at San Diego, operating off California and conducting exercises in Hawaiian waters. During Fleet Problem Namo in 1929, Saratoga demonstrated carrier aviation's potential by successfully launching a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor defenses, destroying theoretical targets before defenders could react. The attack was a training exercise, but it proved that carrier aircraft could strike defended harbors successfully. The lessons were studied by both American and Japanese naval planners. 12 years later, Japanese carriers would execute a real attack on Pearl Harbor using tactics that resembled Fleet Problem 9 closely. When war began on December 7, 1941, Saratoga was not at Pearl Harbor. She had departed San Diego on December 5, delivering Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 221 to Wake Island. She was 500 miles west of Hawaii when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, too far away to intervene, but close enough that her crew heard the radio reports. Saratoga arrived at Pearl Harbor on December 15, 1941. The harbor was still recovering from the attack. Arizona lay capsized and burning. Oklahoma had rolled over. California and West Virginia rested on the bottom. The battleship fleet that had dominated American naval planning for decades was destroyed or damaged. Aircraft carriers were now the primary striking force of the Pacific Fleet, and there were only 3 operational Enterprise Lexington and Saratoga. They would have to hold the Pacific until reinforcements arrived. Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet on December 17, 1941, immediately organized carrier task forces for offensive operations. He assigned Saratoga to Task Force 14 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with orders to relieve Wake Island, which was under sustained Japanese attack. Task Force 14 sailed from Pearl Harbor on December 16, 1941, with Saratoga, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and a fleet oiler. The force also escorted USS Tangier, carrying marine reinforcements and ammunition for Wake's defenders. The mission was to break through Japanese forces surrounding Wakeland, the reinforcements, and provide air support. The force moved slowly. Fletcher maintained 13 knots to conserve fuel and stay with the slower oiler. By December 22, Task Force 14 was still 600 miles from Wake. Japanese forces captured Wake Island on December 23, before American relief forces arrived. Fletcher received orders to abort the mission and return to Pearl Harbor. Saratoga's first war mission had accomplished nothing. Wake Island fell while reinforcements steamed too slowly to arrive in time. The failure demonstrated the challenges facing American forces. Too few ships spread across too much ocean, always arriving too late to prevent Japanese conquests. For the next month, Saratoga conducted patrol operations around Hawaii and supported convoy escort missions. On January 11, 1942, she departed Pearl Harbor as flagship of Task Force 14 to conduct strikes against Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific. The operation aimed to disrupt Japanese consolidation and demonstrate American resolve. At 7:30 hours on January 11, 1942, Japanese submarine I-6 torpedoed Saratoga 500 miles southwest of Hawaii. The torpedo hit on the port side, tearing a 40-foot hole below the waterline and flooding 3 compartments. The explosion killed 6 men and knocked out 3 of 4 turbo-electric drive units. Saratoga's speed dropped from 20 knots to 6 knots. Damage control teams worked through the day, containing flooding and restoring power. Temporary repairs allowed Saratoga to increase speed to 16 knots. Under destroyer escort, she limped back to Pearl Harbor, arriving January 13th. Initial repairs took 3 weeks. Then, Saratoga sailed to Bremerton Navy Yard in Washington for complete repairs and modernization. The repairs took 5 months. While Saratoga was unavailable, the Pacific Fleet fought the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway with only 3 carriers. Lexington was sunk at Coral Sea on May 8, 1942. Yorktown was sunk at Midway on June 7, 1942. By mid-June, the United States Pacific Fleet had only 2 operational fleet carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. Saratoga completed repairs on June 1, 1942, and returned to Pearl Harbor on June 6, the day before Yorktown sank. After working up and embarking Air Group 3, Saratoga sailed for the South Pacific on August 7, 1942, the day Allied forces invaded Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal campaign would define Saratoga's war. For the next 6 months, she would be the only American fleet carrier continuously operating in the South Pacific, providing air support for Marines fighting on Guadalcanal, protecting supply convoys, and engaging Japanese naval forces attempting to retake the island. Saratoga arrived off Guadalcanal on August 20, 1942, joining Task Force 61 under Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The task force included Enterprise Saratoga and WASP with escorts. The mission was to protect American supply lines to Guadalcanal and intercept Japanese reinforcement convoys. On August 24, Japanese carriers approached Guadalcanal intending to support a major reinforcement operation. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons developed when American and Japanese carrier forces made contact. Saratoga launched 38 aircraft in the first strike. Enterprise launched 29 aircraft. The combined strike found the Japanese light carrier Ryujo at 14:05 hours on August 24th. American dive bombers attacked Ryujo with 10 to 15 bomb hits that set the carrier ablaze. Ryujo sank at 2,000 hours. But while American aircraft attacked Ryujo, Japanese carrier aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku attacked Enterprise. Enterprise took 3 bomb hits that killed 77 men and required months of repairs. Saratoga recovered her own aircraft and many from Enterprise after the battle. Task Force 61 withdrew south to refuel. By August 26, Saratoga was the only operational American fleet carrier in the South Pacific. Enterprise was withdrawing to Pearl Harbor for repairs. WASP was operating separately, covering convoy operations. For the next week, Saratoga provided the only fleet carrier air support for Guadalcanal operations. Her aircraft flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field, attacked Japanese shipping, and supported marine ground operations. The carrier operated continuously at sea, launching and recovering aircraft around the clock. Then came August 31, 1942, and Japanese submarine I-26's torpedo attack. The damage from I-26's torpedo was severe but not fatal. Water flooded 3 fire rooms and 1 generator room. Electrical failures knocked out radar communications and fire control systems. The list stabilized at 8 degrees after counterflooding. Speed was limited to 13 knots with only 1 turboelectric unit operational. Damage control parties worked through the day restoring systems and containing flooding. By evening, 2 turboelectric units were operational and speed increased to 18 knots. But Saratoga could not operate aircraft at 18 knots. The flight deck wind, required for launching heavily loaded aircraft, was 25 knots. Without more speed, Saratoga was useless as a carrier. WASP moved to cover Saratoga's withdrawal. On September 15th, while escorting a troop convoy to Guadalcanal, WASP was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-19. 3 torpedoes hit WASP, starting uncontrollable fires. WASP was abandoned and sank at 2100 hours. In 2 weeks, Japanese submarines had removed both available American fleet carriers from the South Pacific. Hornet arrived from Pearl Harbor on September 23, 1942, becoming the only American fleet carrier in the South Pacific. Saratoga sailed to Pearl Harbor for repairs, arriving September 24th. Initial repairs took 4 weeks. Then Saratoga sailed to Bremerton Navy Yard for complete repairs and modernization. The repairs took 3 months. Anti-aircraft armament was substantially increased. The 8-inch gun turrets were removed and replaced with 40mm quad gun mounts and 20mm single guns. Fire control systems were upgraded. Radar was replaced with newer models. When Saratoga emerged from Bremerton in December 1942, she carried 72 anti-aircraft guns compared to 12 when the war started. While Saratoga was under repair, the naval battle of Guadalcanal was fought. Hornet was sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942. Enterprise was damaged at Santa Cruz and withdrew for repairs. For 2 critical weeks in November 1942, the United States had no operational fleet carriers in the Pacific. Battleships and cruisers fought the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12, 15, 1942, in a series of brutal surface actions. American forces lost 6 destroyers and 2 light cruisers. Japanese forces lost 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 3 destroyers. The battle prevented Japanese reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal, but the cost was terrible. Saratoga returned to the South Pacific on December 5, 1942. For the next 6 months, she operated continuously off Guadalcanal, providing air support for the final phases of the campaign. Her aircraft attacked Japanese shipping, bombed Japanese positions, and provided combat air patrol over American forces. The operational tempo was punishing. Saratoga spent 85 of 90 days at sea from December 1942 through February 1943. Flight operations continued day and night. Pilots flew multiple missions daily. Deck crews worked 18-hour shifts. The ship was refueled and resupplied at sea from fleet oilers and ammunition ships without returning to port. On November 11, 1942, Saratoga's aircraft participated in a major strike against Japanese shipping near Bougainville. Torpedo bombers from Saratoga and Enterprise sank the Japanese heavy cruiser Kinugasa and damaged two other cruisers. On January 30, 1943, Saratoga aircraft attacked Japanese destroyers evacuating troops from Guadalcanal, damaging two destroyers. The Guadalcanal campaign officially ended on February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces completed their evacuation. American forces had secured the island after 6 months of continuous combat. Saratoga had provided carrier air support longer than any other American carrier operating under combat conditions from August 1942 through February 1943, except for the 3 months she was under repair. After Guadalcanal, Saratoga moved to support operations in the New Georgia Island Group. From May through August 1943, her aircraft attacked Japanese positions at Munda Vila and Rakata Bay. On July 6, 1943, her aircraft helped cover the landing of American forces at Rice Anchorage. Throughout the Central Solomons campaign, Saratoga provided continuous air support. In September 1943, Saratoga was withdrawn to Pearl Harbor for maintenance and crew rest. She had been in continuous combat operations for 9 months. The crew was exhausted. Aircraft losses had been severe. The ship needed mechanical overhaul. Saratoga spent September through November 1943 at Pearl Harbor, conducting maintenance and training replacement pilots. In November 1943, Saratoga sailed for the Southwest Pacific to support operations against Rabaul, the major Japanese base in New Britain. Vice Admiral Frederick Sherman commanded Task Force 38, which included Saratoga and the new light carrier Princeton. The mission was to conduct strikes against Rabaul's harbor and airfields to prevent Japanese forces from interfering with American operations in the Solomon Islands. On November 5, 1943, Saratoga launched 23 torpedo bombers, 22 dive bombers, and 52 fighters against Rabaul. The strike destroyed or damaged 7 Japanese cruisers and 2 destroyers in the harbor. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down 10 American aircraft. Saratoga recovered 97 of 107 aircraft launched. On November 11, 1943, Saratoga launched a second strike against Rabaul with similar forces. This strike destroyed Japanese aircraft on the ground and damaged harbor facilities. Japanese forces at Rabaul were effectively neutralized, unable to interfere with American operations in the Solomons. After Rabaul, Saratoga returned to Pearl Harbor for another maintenance period. In January 1944, she sailed to the Indian Ocean to join British Eastern Fleet, becoming the first American carrier to operate with British forces during the war. The mission was to conduct strikes against Japanese-held ports in Sumatra and Java. From January through May 1944, Saratoga operated as part of the British Eastern Fleet under Admiral James Somerville. The combined force included Saratoga British carrier Illustrious, 3 battleships, and cruiser and destroyer escorts. On January 25, 1944, the force struck Sabang Harbor in northern Sumatra, destroying oil storage facilities and damaging port installations. On April 19, 1944, Saratoga and Illustrious launched strikes against Sabang, again destroying or damaging Japanese shipping and aircraft. On May 17, 1944, the force struck Surabaya on Java, attacking harbor facilities and oil refineries. These strikes disrupted Japanese oil supply lines and demonstrated Allied naval power in the Indian Ocean. In May 1944, Saratoga returned to Bremerton Navy Yard for a major overhaul. Anti-aircraft armament was increased again. Radar was updated. Crew accommodations were improved. The overhaul took 4 months. When Saratoga emerged in September 1944, she carried 96 anti-aircraft guns and the most advanced radar and fire control systems available. Saratoga returned to combat in September 1944, assigned to provide night fighter coverage for fast carrier task forces during the Philippines campaign. She embarked Night Air Group 53 equipped with F-6F Hellcat night fighters with radar. This was a specialized role that utilized Saratoga's size and capability while keeping her away from the main day actions where newer, faster carriers operated. In October 1944, Saratoga provided night fighter coverage during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Her night fighters intercepted Japanese aircraft attempting to attack American shipping at night. On October 26, 1944, Saratoga aircraft attacked Japanese airfields on Luzon, destroying aircraft on the ground. Throughout November and December 1944, Saratoga operated off the Philippines, providing night fighter coverage and attacking Japanese targets. The role was less glamorous than day strikes with massive formations, but night operations were critical for preventing Japanese night attacks on American task forces. On February 21, 1945, Saratoga was assigned to support the invasion of Iwo Jima. She joined Task Force 58, positioning herself to provide close air support for Marines landing on the island. The Japanese had anticipated American landings and positioned kamikaze aircraft at nearby airfields. At 1700 hours on February 20, 1945, 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters conducting kamikaze attacks approached Task Force 58. Combat Air Patrol shot down 4. 2 broke through. 1-0 dove on Saratoga from astern, crashing into the flight deck at the base of the island structure. The kamikaze's bomb exploded on the hangar deck, starting fires and killing 123 men. 3 minutes later, a second Zero crashed into Saratoga's flight deck forward of the first hit. The aircraft's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, starting more fires and killing additional men. Within minutes, Saratoga had taken 2 kamikaze hits that killed 123 men, wounded 192, and destroyed 36 aircraft in the hangar. Damage control teams fought fires for 3 hours. The flight deck was torn open in 2 locations. Hangar deck fires threatened ammunition magazines. Electrical systems failed throughout the ship. But Saratoga's crew contained the fires, prevented magazine explosions, and maintained power to essential systems. 5 minutes after the second kamikaze hit, a Japanese bomb struck Saratoga's flight deck amidships. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded in crew berthing spaces, killing 43 more men. Total casualties from the attacks were 123 killed and 192 wounded, Saratoga's worst single-day loss of the war. But Saratoga did not sink. Her hull was intact, her machinery was operational, her propulsion system maintained power. After temporary repairs, Saratoga could still make 16 knots. She withdrew to Eniwetok, then sailed to Bremerton for repairs. The February 21st damage was Saratoga's 5th major battle damage incident. Torpedoed, January 1942, torpedoed, August 1942, bombed, November 1943 by Japanese aircraft near Rabaul during a night raid that caused minor damage, and now 2 kamikazes and a bomb on February 21st, 1945. Each time Saratoga survived and returned to service. The repairs from the Iwo Jima damage took 4 months. When Saratoga emerged from Bremerton in May 1945, the war was nearly over. Japan was being bombed daily by B-29s. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The fast carrier task forces dominated Japanese waters. There was no role for an old, slow carrier that could barely make 25 knots. Saratoga spent the final months of the war as a training carrier operating off California, with pilots and crews working up for deployment. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Saratoga was at sea off San Diego conducting training operations. After the war, the Navy had to decide what to do with its wartime fleet. Dozens of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were no longer needed. Most would be scrapped or mothballed. But Saratoga had a different fate. she would be expended in atomic bomb tests. Operation Crossroads was designed to test nuclear weapons effects on naval vessels. The tests would be conducted at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in July 1946. 2 detonations were planned: Able, an air burst at 520 feet altitude, and Baker, an underwater burst 90 feet below the surface. Target fleet for Operation Crossroads included 95 vessels, surplus American battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines and auxiliaries, captured German and Japanese warships, and old vessels no longer useful. Saratoga was designated as a target ship because she was obsolete, too slow for modern fast carrier operations, and represented a major capital ship whose destruction would provide valuable data. Saratoga was stripped of useful equipment, loaded with measurement instruments, and positioned 700 yards from ground zero for the Able test. The target fleet was arranged in a circle around ground zero with ships at various distances to measure blast effects. Test Able was conducted on July 1, 1946. The bomb detonated at 520 feet altitude with a yield of 23 kilotons. The airburst was less effective than predicted. Only 5 ships sank from Able test damage: 2 destroyers, 2 transports, and 1 submarine. Saratoga survived Able test with moderate damage: funnel blown over, flight deck damage, hull breached in several locations. Test Baker was conducted on July 25, 1946. The bomb was suspended 90 feet below the surface. Detonation yield was 23 kilotons. The underwater explosion was far more destructive than the airburst. A massive column of water rose 6,000 feet into the air. Ships directly over the detonation were destroyed instantly. Ships nearby were capsized or heavily damaged by the shock wave. Saratoga was positioned 400 yards from Baker Ground Zero. The underwater shock wave hit her hull with enormous force. Plates buckled, seams split, water flooded dozens of compartments. Saratoga took an immediate heavy list to starboard as flooding overwhelmed her damaged watertight integrity. For the next 7.5 hours, Saratoga slowly settled. Water spread through her engineering spaces and magazines. The list increased to 25 degrees, then 40 degrees. At 16:30 hours on July 25, 1946, USS Saratoga rolled over and sank in 180 feet of water. She had survived 24 years of service, 6 years of peacetime operations, 3 years and 8 months of war. She had been hit by 2 torpedoes, 3 bombs, and 2 kamikazes. She had been torpedoed, twice bombed, multiple times, crashed into by suicide aircraft, and survived all of it. Only a 23-kiloton nuclear detonation 400 yards away could sink her. Saratoga earned 7 battle stars during World War II, more than any other American carrier. She participated in every major campaign in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal through Iwo Jima, except Midway, when she was under repair. She served longer in combat than any other pre-war American carrier. Lexington was sunk in May 1942, Yorktown in June 1942, Wasp in September 1942, Hornet in October 1942. Enterprise was damaged so frequently, she spent more time under repair than at sea. But Saratoga kept fighting. When other carriers were sunk or damaged, Saratoga was at sea launching strikes. When the Pacific Fleet was reduced to a single carrier, that carrier was usually Saratoga. Her crew called her the Sara, a nickname that reflected both affection and the ship's reputation for being damaged frequently, but always returning to service. The nickname also acknowledged Saratoga's age and origins. She was designed in 1916, laid down in 1920, commissioned in 1927. By 1945 standards, she was ancient. The Essex-class carriers commissioned from 1943 onward were faster carried, more aircraft had better armor, and superior anti-aircraft armament. But none had Saratoga's record of sustained combat operations. Part of Saratoga's survivability came from her construction. Built as a battle cruiser with 7-inch belt armor and extensive internal subdivision, she could absorb damage that would sink purpose-built carriers. Her turbo-electric propulsion system provided redundancy. 4 independent drive units meant that losing one or two still left propulsion available. But survivability also came from her crew. Damage control parties trained constantly. When Saratoga was hit, damage control teams responded immediately with procedures perfected through multiple battle damage experiences. Flooding was contained, fires were extinguished, temporary repairs restored capability quickly. The crew knew their ship intimately and could keep her fighting under conditions that would force other ships to withdraw. Saratoga's pilots and air crews were equally capable. Air Group 3, which served aboard Saratoga for much of 1942-1943, became one of the most experienced carrier air groups in the Navy. Pilots who flew from Saratoga during Guadalcanal and the Solomons campaigns went on to serve as instructors, squadron commanders, and air group commanders. They trained the next generation of carrier aviators. After Saratoga sank at Bikini, she rested on the bottom in 180 feet of water. The wreck was surveyed in the 1950s and 1960s by Navy divers assessing nuclear effects on sunken ships. The wreck remained largely intact, lying upright on the bottom with flight deck at 110 feet depth. In the 1980s, recreational diving became possible at Bikini Atoll after radiation levels decreased to acceptable levels. Saratoga became one of the world's premier wreck diving sites. The immense carrier lying in clear tropical water attracted divers from around the world. The flight deck hangar and machinery spaces are accessible. Aircraft still rest on the hangar deck where they were positioned for the Baker test. The wreck is remarkably intact considering she sank 78 years ago. The wooden flight deck has rotted away, but the steel structure beneath remains solid. The island superstructure is recognizable. Elevators are frozen in position. Propellers and rudders are visible. Marine life has colonized every surface, creating artificial reefs from a warship. Diving Saratoga is like visiting a museum. The ship that fought through World War II, that survived everything Japan threw at her, that represented the peak of American carrier capability in the 1920s and 1930s, rests in water, clear enough to photograph. It is a time capsule frozen in July 1946, when nuclear testing ended her service. The men who served aboard Saratoga held reunions for decades after the war. They told stories about life aboard the Sara, about flight operations during Guadalcanal, about being torpedoed twice and bombed 3 times, and always making it home. As the years passed and the generation that fought World War II aged, the reunions grew smaller. Now most of Saratoga's crew are gone, but Saratoga's legacy remains. Modern American carriers trace their lineage directly to the converted battlecruisers of 1927. The lessons learned operating Saratoga and Lexington shaped carrier doctrine for decades. Flight deck procedures, aircraft handling, damage control practices, all were developed and refined aboard those 2 massive ships during the 1920s and 1930s. When Japanese carriers attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, they used tactics that resembled American fleet exercises from the 1930s exercises that Saratoga participated in. When American carriers struck back across the Pacific from 1942 through 1945, they used doctrine developed partly from Saratoga's operations. The ship that started as a battle cruiser in 1920 helped create the carrier-centered fleet that won the Pacific War. Saratoga's 7 battle stars tell only part of her story. Battle stars measure participation in campaigns, not impact. Saratoga's impact was continuous presence when presence mattered most. In late 1942 and early 1943, when American carrier strength was at its lowest, when the Guadalcanal campaign could have failed for lack of air support, Saratoga was there. She provided air cover when no other carrier could. She launched strikes when American forces needed close air support. She kept fighting when being hit would have justified withdrawal. That sustained presence, that refusal to quit, that determination to keep launching aircraft no matter what damage the ship had taken, that was Saratoga's contribution. The ship was never the fastest, never the most modern, never the most glamorous. By 1944, Essex-class carriers were operating with air groups of 100 aircraft, while Saratoga carried 70. By 1945, other carriers could make 33 knots while Saratoga struggled to reach 28 knots after multiple torpedo hits. But Saratoga was always there, always fighting, always operational when the Navy needed carriers. That reliability, that resilience, that stubborn refusal to sink earned Saratoga her place in naval history. She was the ship that was never sunk in combat despite being hit repeatedly by weapons that sank other carriers. She was the most decorated American carrier of World War II. And when the war ended, when she had survived everything Japan could throw at her, it took a nuclear weapon to sink her. On July 25, 1946, as Saratoga slowly capsized and slipped beneath the surface of Bikini Lagoon, observers noted that she went down with her flag still flying from the mast. It was fitting. For 24 years, through peacetime and war, through torpedo hits and bomb strikes and kamikaze crashes, Saratoga had kept fighting. Even in death, she refused to surrender. That spirit, that determination, that legacy is why Saratoga deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest warships in American naval history. Not because she was perfect, but because she was there when it mattered, fighting when others could not, refusing to quit when quitting would have been understandable. That is what makes a ship legendary. That is what makes a ship immortal. Saratoga rests in the waters of Bikini Atoll today, visited by divers who swim through spaces where pilots briefed before strikes, where mechanics maintained aircraft, where damage control parties fought fires and floods. The ship is a memorial to the 3,000 men who served aboard her during the war, to the 200 who died in combat, to the aircraft that launched from her deck and never returned. The ship that started as a battle cruiser, that became a carrier, that fought through World War II and survived everything except a nuclear weapon, rests now where she sank, silent, still, a monument to an age of warfare that she helped create, and that